What if the Sahara never dried out? 14,500 years ago, on a morning indistinguishable from 10,000 mornings before it, rain fell across nearly 4 million square miles of what would one day be called the Sahara. It fell on grasslands that rolled unbroken from the Atlantic coast almost to the banks of the Nile. It fell on forests of acacia and tamarisk crowding the shores of lakes so vast that some of them would have swallowed entire modern countries. It fell on herds of buffalo and antelope grazing beside elephants and giraffes, on crocodiles gliding through slow green rivers, on hippopotamuses wallowing in waterways that today exist only as faint pale scars visible from orbit, in a place where you can now walk for 1,000 miles without finding a single drop of standing water. This was not a brief green flicker in an otherwise eternal desert. For nearly 10,000 years, the region that would become the largest hot desert on Earth was something almost unrecognizable. A savanna roughly the size of the continental United States, threaded with rivers, dotted with lakes, and absolutely full of life. Scientists call this the African humid period, and it is one of the most dramatic climate transformations in the recent geological record. It began roughly 14,500 years ago, as shifts in Earth's orbit strengthened the West African monsoon and pushed it deep into what had previously been desert. And for a long moment in geological time, the Sahara breathed. Consider what that world actually held. Across what is today southern Libya and northern Chad, seasonal wetlands stretched wide enough that migratory waterbirds used them as reliable stopover points on journeys between Europe and the heart of Africa, the way they use the Nile Delta or the wetlands of the Okavango today. In the region that is now the driest, most lifeless stretch of the Eastern Sahara, fishing communities built their lives around lake shores that supported catfish and tilapia in numbers large enough to sustain permanent settlement. Not brief camps, but real villages, their pottery and harpoon points still turning up in the sand today, sometimes lying in plain sight on the surface of dunes that have since buried and re-exposed them more than once. None of it looked like desert. None of it behaved like desert. It was, by every ecological measure that matters, simply Africa, continuous and green from the Mediterranean coast to the equator. Then, slowly at first, and then with what looks, in the sediment record, almost like a slammed door, it stopped. Beginning around 6,000 years ago, the rains began to fail. Lakes that had taken millennia to fill began to shrink. The grasslands browned and thinned. The great animals retreated southward, following the vanishing water generation by generation, until the descendants of Saharan hippos and elephants and giraffes were confined to the belt of savanna far to the south that we now call the Sahel. The humans who had built lives around those lakes, who had painted their cattle and their swimmers and their dancers on rock walls that still survive today, moved too, funneling toward the only reliable water left standing, the Nile. By around 5,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. The Sahara had become the Sahara, sand where there had been grass, dunes where there had been lakes, a silence where there had been the calling of birds over open water. That is what happened. That is the history written in the mud at the bottom of Lake Yoa in Chad, layer after layer of pollen and dust telling the story of a world drying out 1 century at a time. It is written on the sandstone cliffs of Tassili Naja in Algeria, where herders scratched and painted images of swimming men and grazing cattle onto rock that now overlooks nothing but dunes for hundreds of miles in every direction. it is written in the shape of the land itself, in dry river channels that satellite radar can still trace beneath the sand. Rivers that once ran for hundreds of miles and haven't carried water in 5,000 years. But tonight, we're going to imagine a different history. We're going to ask what would have happened if the rains had simply never stopped. If the monsoon that gave the Sahara its decade upon decade, century upon century of green had kept its rhythm, kept pushing north, kept the lakes full and the grass rooted and the rivers running, all the way to tonight, all the way to you, listening to this in whatever quiet room you're in right now. It nearly could have. The specific timing of the African humid period's collapse depended on an interlocking set of variables in Earth's orbital mechanics, in ocean temperatures, in vegetation feedbacks that reinforced themselves once they got started, any one of which, tuned even slightly differently, could have stretched the Green Sahara for another few thousand years, or made its ending gradual instead of abrupt, or in some models, delayed it almost indefinitely. The desert you know is not a certainty written into the bones of the planet. It is the outcome of one particular role among many that were physically possible. So before you get comfortable, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we do here. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. Let the modern world with all its noise fade a little further into the background. Picture wind moving across grass that stretches to a horizon you cannot see the end of. The sound of water somewhere close. Unseen birds calling to each other over a lake that, in our world, dried up before the first pyramid was ever built. This is the story of a desert that never happened, and we're going to walk through every stretch of it together, slowly, from the very beginning. Chapter 1. How we know the rains once fell. The discovery that the Sahara was once green is itself a story worth telling, because it shows how thoroughly a place can hide its own history, and how patiently that history can be dragged back into the light. For a long time, the popular image of the Sahara was the one we still carry around today. An ocean of dunes that had always been an ocean of dunes, timeless and unchanging, a place where nothing had ever really happened except sand moving very slowly across more sand. Early European explorers who crossed it in the 19th century described it that way, and for decades that description simply stuck. But scattered across the desert's mountainous heart, in places like the Tassili-Naja Plateau in southeastern Algeria and the Gilf Kebir in southwestern Egypt, there were paintings, thousands of them, carved and pigmented onto rock faces in overhangs and shallow caves, showing scenes that made no sense at all for a desert. Cattle herds, men swimming, their limbs mid-stroke, hippopotamuses, giraffes with their impossibly long necks rendered in careful, unmistakable detail, crocodiles. When these images were first catalogued in the mid-20th century, they were treated almost as curiosities, folklore scratched onto stone by people who had perhaps travelled from somewhere greener to leave a record of animals they'd seen elsewhere. It took decades of accumulating evidence from an entirely different discipline to establish that the paintings weren't describing somewhere else. They were describing right there. The proof came from beneath the ground rather than from the walls above it. Geologists and paleoclimatologists began drilling into the sediment at the bottom of lakes scattered across the Sahara, extracting long cylindrical cores that read, if you know how to read them, like tree rings stretched out across thousands of years. Each layer of mud holds pollen, blown in from whatever plants were growing nearby at the time it settled. Grass pollen means grassland. Tree pollen means forest. A particular species of diatom, a microscopic algae with a glass-like shell, tells you whether the water was fresh or brackish, deep or shallow, present or absent entirely. Layer by layer, core by core, the story assembled itself with a consistency that left very little room for doubt. This had been a wet, vegetated, animal-rich landscape, and it had been that way for thousands of years, not as some brief anomaly, but as the settled, ordinary condition of the place. One of the most striking pieces of evidence sits in northern Chad at a place called Unianga, where a cluster of deep lakes still exists today, fed by an aquifer that has been slowly draining since the humid period ended. They are, in a very real sense, living fossils, the last visible remnant of a hydrology that once extended across the entire region. Nearby, the sediments of a vanished companion once, part of what geologists call Paleo-Lake Megachad, tell an even more dramatic story. At its largest, Megachad may have rivaled the Caspian Sea in surface area, one of the biggest freshwater lakes that has existed anywhere on the planet in the last several 100,000 years, sitting almost squarely in the middle of what we think of as one of the driest places on Earth. Radar imaging did the rest. Satellites capable of seeing through a thin layer of sand revealed the ghosts of entire river systems buried beneath the dunes, wide meandering channels that once carried real water across hundreds of miles, systems that researchers have since named, that they have traced from source to former outlet, that they can point to on a map with real confidence, even though not one of them has carried a drop of water in thousands of years. By the time all these threads were pulled together, the case was closed in the same way a good detective story closes. Not with a single dramatic clue, but with dozens of independent lines of evidence, from painted rock to buried pollen to fossil river channels, all converging on the same conclusion. The Sahara had been green, then it had dried, and the timing of that drying could be dated with real precision. This is not speculation. This is the floor we build everything else on tonight. Chapter 2. A world balanced on a wobble. Here is the thing about the Sahara's transformation that makes tonight's thought experiment possible in the first place. It was never inevitable. It was not written into the deep structure of the planet that this particular stretch of North Africa had to become a desert. It happened because of a genuinely delicate piece of orbital mechanics, one that could very plausibly have played out differently. Earth doesn't spin on a perfectly fixed axis pointed at a perfectly fixed angle. It wobbles slowly like a spinning top that's beginning to lose momentum, tracing out a full circle roughly every 21,000 years. This wobble is called precession, and it changes which part of Earth's elliptical orbit lines up with which season in each hemisphere. Around 14,500 years ago, precession had shifted things so that northern hemisphere summers occurred when Earth was closest to the sun, which meant those summers ran hotter than they do today. A hotter northern hemisphere summer means more intense heating over the African and Asian land masses, which means air rises faster and pulls moisture in harder from the surrounding oceans, which means a stronger monsoon. That stronger monsoon is what pushed deep into the Sahara and kept it green for thousands of years. But precession doesn't stop. It keeps turning, slowly, inexorably, and by around 6,000 years ago it had shifted enough that the intensified summer heating began to weaken. The monsoon that had been reaching so far north started gradually to retreat. Here is where it gets genuinely interesting. and where the door to our alternate history opens. A gradual gentle retreat of the monsoon, tracking a gradual gentle shift in orbital geometry, is roughly what the astronomy alone would predict. What actually happened, according to many of the sediment records, looks considerably faster and more abrupt than that in a number of regions, as though the system didn't so much fade out as fall over a threshold. And the leading explanation for that abruptness isn't astronomical at all. It's ecological. When grass and shrubs and trees cover a landscape, they hold moisture in the soil, they transpire water back into the air, and they keep the ground dark enough to absorb heat evenly. Strip that vegetation away, even locally, even temporarily, and the exposed pale sand beneath reflects sunlight instead of absorbing it, which cools the local air near the surface, which suppresses the very convection that monsoon rains depend on, which means less rain, which means more vegetation dies, which means more exposed sand. This is a feedback loop, first proposed by the meteorologist Jules Charny in the 1970s, and it has a nasty property. Once it starts running in one direction, it tends to keep running that way, faster than the slow orbital shift that triggered it in the first place. So the true hinge point of our story isn't really the orbital wobble at all, because that wobble happened in our timeline exactly as it's happening in this one. The hinge point is the vegetation feedback, the moment, when a patchy, struggling landscape either recovers before the feedback loop can take hold, or tips past a threshold and drags the whole system down with it. Climate models that adjust the strength of that feedback, or that start the simulation with slightly wetter soil or slightly denser initial vegetation, sometimes produce a Sahara that greens right through the modern day, over 10,000 years later than it actually turned to sand. The difference between our world and the one we're about to imagine may have come down to something as fine-grained as how much rain fell in a handful of particularly dry decades 6,000 years ago, and whether the grass held on through them or didn't. It didn't in our history. Tonight, we imagine that it did. Chapter 3. The world they would have inherited. To understand what might have been, we first need to understand what was, in the last full flush of the Green Sahara, roughly 8,000 years ago at the height of the African humid period, before the drying had even begun. Forget the sand ocean of postcards and documentaries. Picture instead something closer to the Serengeti stretched across an area larger than India. Grasslands dominated the landscape, but they weren't uniform. Along the rivers and around the Great Lakes, gallery forests of acacia and daum palm crowded the banks, thick enough in places to require real effort to walk through. Seasonal wetlands spread out from the lake margins during the wet months, then contracted again in the dry season, exactly the kind of pulsing, breathing hydrology you'd find in the Okavango Delta today. At the region's heart sat Paleo-Lake Mega Chad, and it's worth pausing on its scale because numbers alone don't do it justice. At its peak, estimates put its surface area at somewhere around 350,000 square kilometres, which is larger than the entire modern country of Germany, sitting in the middle of what is today one of the most hyper-arid landscapes on the planet. It was deep enough and stable enough to support its own ecosystem of fish, of crocodiles, of hippos, numerous enough that their fossilized teeth turn up regularly in modern excavations hundreds of miles from the nearest permanent water. Elephants moved across the grasslands in numbers that would be almost impossible to picture today. Not the isolated, embattled populations we associate with African conservation now, but genuinely widespread herds, their bones and their rock art silhouettes turning up from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania all the way to the Nile Valley. Giraffes browsed the acacia canopy. Buffalo, antelope of a dozen different species, and wild cattle grazed the open plains in herds large enough that early human hunters clearly organised entire seasonal strategies around intercepting them. Nile crocodiles, the same species that patrols the river today, lived in lakes and rivers 1,000 miles from the Nile itself. An almost unbelievable fact until you remember that for those crocodiles, this wasn't a foreign outpost. It was simply more of the same connected water system they'd always known. And humans were there too, in real numbers, living lives that had nothing in common with the popular image of desert nomads scraping by at the edges of survival. The rock art at Tassili N'Ajjer, painted across what is now one of the most desolate mountain massifs on the continent, depicts a settled, prosperous pastoral world. Herders with their cattle, women grinding grain, dancers, swimmers, elaborate figures in ceremonial dress that suggest social complexity, well beyond simple subsistence. Archaeological sites around the shores of the vanished lakes have produced fishing hooks, harpoons, pottery, grinding stones for processing wild grains, and cemeteries containing hundreds of burials, evidence of communities that stayed in one place across generations, because the place itself was reliable enough to make that possible. The vegetation itself would have varied considerably across the region's enormous breadth, the way vegetation varies across any landmass this size, rather than presenting as one uniform green blanket. Near the Great Lakes and along the rivers, the growth was densest, true gallery forest, tall enough in places to close its canopy overhead, home to the kind of shade-loving understory plants that need consistent year-round moisture to survive. Further from permanent water, the landscape opened into savanna proper, grass punctuated by scattered acacia and the occasional baobab, the same general character you'd recognise from East Africa today. And at the driest margins, where the monsoon's reach was thinnest, a transitional scrubland persisted, tougher, more drought-tolerant vegetation that could weather a poor rainy season without dying back entirely, not unlike the semi-arid Sahel that today marks the desert's actual southern edge, except that in this version of the world, that edge sat hundreds of miles further north than it currently does, and the true desert it bordered on its far side was, if it existed at all, a far smaller and more marginal thing than the immense sand ocean we actually inherited. This was not a marginal environment that people merely endured. It was, by the standards of the time, one of the richest inhabited landscapes on the continent, and there is no particular reason, ecologically speaking, that it couldn't have simply continued being that. The lake systems were stable, the vegetation was well established, the animal populations were thriving and diverse. If the monsoon had simply held its ground rather than retreating, there is no obvious limit to how long this world could have persisted essentially unchanged, the way similarly wet savanna and lake systems have persisted for tens of thousands of years elsewhere on the continent. But the world was about to change, not through any failure of this ecosystem, but through the same slow, astronomical clockwork that had built it in the first place, now running in reverse. The question our alternate history has to answer is what a Sahara that resisted that reversal, that held its green through the transition rather than tipping into desert, would have become over the 10,000 years since. Let's find out. Chapter 4. The Myth of the Eternal Desert. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on something that gets told and retold in documentaries and textbooks and casual conversation alike, and that turns out to be almost entirely backward. the idea that the Sahara has always essentially been the Sahara. That deserts of this kind are ancient, permanent features of the planet, geological constants that have looked more or less the way they look now for millions of years, occasionally interrupted by brief, freak wet spells before returning to their true, sandy nature. It's an intuitive story. Deserts feel old, dunes feel eternal, and there is a kernel of truth buried in it. Because parts of the Sahara really have been arid for extremely long stretches of geological time, going back millions of years in some regions. But treating the entire Sahara as a single, unchanging entity badly misreads what the evidence actually shows, which is a landscape that has swung back and forth between green and arid states dozens of times over the last several 100,000 years, tracking the same 21,000-year precession cycle we talked about earlier, again and again and again, like a pendulum with a very, very long period. Sediment cores taken from ocean floor sites off the West African coast, which capture wind-blown Saharan dust deposited over hundreds of thousands of years, show this rhythm with remarkable clarity. Thick layers of dust indicating a dry, exposed, wind-eroded Sahara, alternate with thin, dust-poor layers indicating a vegetated, stabilized landscape that simply wasn't producing much dust to blow offshore in the first place. Researchers have counted more than 200 of these humid arid cycles stretching back several million years. This Sahara, in other words, isn't a desert that occasionally accidentally turns green. It's a landscape that oscillates between green and desert as a matter of routine, on a clock set by the wobble of the planet's axis, and what we happen to be living through right now, in our actual history, is simply one of the arid phases of that ancient rhythm. This matters enormously for how we think about the road not taken tonight. If the Sahara's true, ancient nature were desert, with green periods as the anomaly, then a Sahara that stayed green past 6,000 years ago would be some kind of aberration, a system running against its own grain, requiring some special ongoing explanation to keep it from collapsing back into sand. But that isn't the case. Green Saharas of comparable duration to the one we're imagining have happened many times before in the planet's recent history, entirely without special explanation, simply as the natural consequence of orbital geometry lining up the way it lines up roughly every 21,000 years. A green Sahara that persisted for another several thousand years past its actual expiration date isn't fighting against the deep nature of the place. It's simply a version of something the region has done, comfortably and repeatedly, dozens of times before. A world that briefly, wrongly, gets remembered as an anomaly, when really it was simply taking its regular turn. The Sahara isn't a desert that briefly, mistakenly became green. Both stories get flattened by hindsight into something that sounds more inevitable than it actually was. Once you understand the real rhythm this land moves to, our alternate timeline stops looking like a fantasy and starts looking like something closer to a coin landing on the other side of where it actually landed. Let's walk forward through that other landing, one stretch of time at a time. Chapter 5. The first 1,000 years after the rains stayed. Picture the divergence point itself, roughly 6,000 years ago in the exact centuries when, in our history, the rains began to fail. In this timeline, they don't. The monsoon, weakening on schedule as the orbital geometry shifts, simply doesn't cross the threshold that triggers the vegetation feedback loop into runaway collapse. The grass holds. The soil stays dark enough to keep absorbing heat evenly. The rain, a little lighter than it had been at the humid period's peak, but still substantial, keeps falling where it's always fallen. If you could stand on the shores of Paleo Lake Mega Chad in this alternate first millennium after the divergence, you might not notice anything dramatically different from the world 8,000 years earlier. That's the nature of an ecosystem holding steady rather than one collapsing. The absence of catastrophe doesn't announce itself. The lake is a little smaller than it was at the humid period's absolute peak, its shoreline having crept inward somewhat as the monsoon settled into its new, slightly reduced equilibrium, but it is still enormous, still teeming with fish, still ringed with the same gallery forests and seasonal wetlands that had defined it for thousands of years. The human communities living around these water bodies would have faced a genuinely different set of pressures than their real-world counterparts did during this same period. In our actual history, this is exactly when the drying forced difficult, wrenching adaptations. Pastoralists whose herds could no longer find adequate grazing, fishing communities whose lakes were visibly shrinking year over year, entire settlements that had to be abandoned as wells ran dry and rivers stopped flowing. Archaeological evidence from this period in our timeline shows exactly this kind of stress. Smaller settlements, more mobile lifestyles, a shift toward the kind of nomadic pastoralism that would come to define Saharan life for the next several thousand years. In our alternate timeline, none of that pressure ever arrives. The lakes don't shrink, the wells don't fail. The pastoral, settled way of life depicted so vividly in the Tassili Naja rock art simply continues, generation after generation, without the demographic upheaval that, in our history, eventually emptied the region almost entirely. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means something significant for how population would have distributed itself across the wider region. In our history, the drying Sahara acted like a slowly closing door, funneling people who had once been spread across an entire subcontinent into an ever-narrowing set of refuges, the Nile Valley above all, but also the highlands of the Sahel further south, and a scattering of oases that survived on isolated aquifers. That funneling concentrated population, technology, and eventually political power into a small number of places with extraordinary intensity, and it's not a coincidence that one of the most sophisticated early civilizations on the planet arose precisely in the narrowest, most concentrated of those refuges, squeezed onto a ribbon of fertile land a few miles wide on either side of a single river. In our alternate timeline, that funnel never forms. Population remains distributed across a vast, still habitable landscape, rather than being forced together onto the Nile. Whatever complex societies eventually emerge here, and we'll get to them, they won't emerge under the same specific pressure that shaped Old Kingdom Egypt. The necessity of ferociously precise, centrally coordinated management of a single, narrow strip of water. This is speculation, of course, built on general principles of settlement geography rather than any evidence we could dig up from a world that never existed. But it's speculation grounded in something we can observe directly in our own timeline, which is that the specific, distinctive shape of early Nile civilization owed a great deal to the specific, distinctive shape of the geography that produced it. Change the geography, and you very plausibly change what grows out of it. The first 1,000 years pass, in this other Sahara, largely as a continuation of what came before. Green, settled, prosperous, watched over by the same slow, orbital clock that had built it in the first place, now simply continuing to tick in humanity's favour rather than against it. Chapter 6. The rivers that never die down on the forest floor of any world. So much depends on water finding its way from where it falls to where it's needed, and this alternate Sahara would have been defined, quite literally, by rivers that in our own history exist only as ghosts. Radar mapping of the real Sahara has revealed the buried courses of several major river systems that once carried substantial flow across the desert, systems large enough that they clearly shaped the landscape for thousands of years before falling silent. The Tamanrasat River, sometimes called the Tamanrasset, is one of the largest of these, tracing a course that would have run for hundreds of miles from the Hoggar Mountains in southern Algeria northwestward toward the Atlantic, a river system so substantial in its former life that its ancient channel is clearly visible in satellite imagery, wide and meandering in exactly the way you'd expect from a permanent, mature river rather than a rare flash flood. The Ihaha River, further east, traced a similarly long path from mountainous headwaters down into the Sahara's interior basins. Neither has carried meaningful water in thousands of years. Both are today simply pale channels in the sand, visible from space and invisible from the ground. In our alternate timeline, these rivers never went silent. Picture the Tamanrasat still running, still fed by rainfall on the Hoggar Highlands that in our world produces only the rare, brief flash flood, carrying water steadily northwestward across hundreds of miles of what would otherwise be empty desert, supporting a ribbon of gallery forest and wetland along its entire length, a green thread stitched across the middle of the world's largest hot desert. Communities would have grown up along its banks the way communities grow up along any reliable river. Fishing villages, agricultural settlements exploiting the fertile floodplain soil, trade routes following the easiest, most watered path across otherwise difficult terrain. The same would be true of the Ihaha and the other buried river systems radar has revealed across the region, each one a potential spine for its own cluster of settlement and culture, none of them concentrated into a single overwhelming valley, the way the Nile concentrated Egyptian civilization, but each significant in its own right. Smaller satellite lakes, dozens of them scattered across the wider basin, fed by the same rains and the same underground aquifers that sustained Megachad itself, would have persisted too, each one supporting its own modest fishing and farming communities. A whole constellation of settled life spread across a basin that in our actual world holds nothing but dust and memory. The lake systems too would have persisted, and likely expanded rather than merely holding steady. Megachad, having weathered the divergence point without collapsing, would have continued behaving the way large, stable lake systems behave, filling further during wetter multi-decade cycles, contracting slightly during drier ones, but never disappearing, never crossing the threshold into the kind of terminal decline that, in our history, eventually left only the small relic lakes at Unyanga as its final surviving fragment. Unyanga itself, rather than being a haunting last remnant of a vanished world, would simply be one modest lake system among many across a landscape still generously supplied with water, unremarkable in a way that, frankly, might have made it far less scientifically interesting to us than it actually is in our own timeline, where its very survival against the encroaching desert around it is what makes it worth studying at all. It's worth pausing on what this hydrology would have meant for the wider African continent, and not just for the Sahara itself. A network of rivers threading north from the humid tropics all the way toward the Mediterranean coast would have functioned as exactly the kind of corridor that, in our actual deep history, allowed early humans and countless other species to move back and forth between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world during earlier Green Sahara episodes hundreds of thousands of years ago. In our timeline, that corridor slammed shut around 6,000 years ago and has stayed shut ever since, turning the Sahara from a connective tissue between two halves of a continent into one of the most formidable barriers to movement on the entire planet. In this alternate timeline, the corridor never closes. Species migrate, people migrate. Ideas, goods, languages, and genes move back and forth across a landscape that, in our world, has spent the last 6,000 years being almost as effective a barrier as an ocean. We'll come back to what that continuous corridor means for human history in a few chapters, because it matters enormously. For now, just hold the image. A Sahara stitched through with living rivers, its lakes full rather than fossilized, a green throughway running the length of a continent that, in our world, was cut cleanly in two. Chapter 7. A Nile that never had to carry everyone. Now we arrive at one of the more delicate questions in this whole thought experiment, because it involves a civilization most of us think we know well, and asking what would have happened to it requires being honest about what we can and can't actually claim. In our history, ancient Egypt developed along an extraordinarily narrow ribbon of fertile land, rarely more than a dozen miles wide, hemmed in on both sides by desert that offered essentially nothing to a farming society. This geography produced, almost by necessity, a particular kind of political and social organisation, intensely centralised, because managing the Nile's annual flood cycle for irrigation across an entire narrow valley rewarded coordination at scale. Intensely hierarchical, because the difference between a well-managed and poorly managed flood season could mean the difference between surplus and famine for the whole population strung out along the river, and intensely concentrated because there was quite simply nowhere else viable nearby to disperse to. Historians and archaeologists have long argued that this specific geographic pressure cooker is part of what produced the specific form Egyptian civilization took. Unified kingship emerging remarkably early, monumental building projects that required coordinating labour across the entire valley, a bureaucratic and religious apparatus built around managing that one irreplaceable river. In our alternate timeline, that pressure cooker never fully forms, because the Nile is no longer the only game in the region. Population that, in our history, was squeezed almost entirely onto the river's narrow floodplain remains, spread across a vastly larger habitable landscape. The shores of Mega Chad, the banks of the Tamanrasat and the Irhaha and their tributaries, the grasslands and wetlands still stretching across the Sahara's interior. The Nile Valley would certainly still be settled, still be fertile, still be an attractive place to live, but it would be one good place among several, rather than the singular, non-negotiable refuge it became in our history once everything around it had turned to sand. What grows in the Nile Valley under those conditions is genuinely difficult to say with any confidence, and it's important to be honest about that rather than simply inventing a tidy alternate Egypt to fill the gap. This is speculation, clearly and explicitly, but it's speculation grounded in a real and fairly well-supported idea in archaeology, that extreme environmental constraint often produces extreme political centralization as a kind of adaptive response, and that societies with more room to spread out, more alternative locations available to them, tend to develop in more distributed, less centralized directions. If that general pattern holds, a Nile Valley civilization that never had to function as the last refuge for any entire displaced population might have developed into something less monolithic than the Egypt we know, perhaps a looser network of river and lake-based city-states scattered across a well-watered North Africa, trading and occasionally competing with each other, none of them commanding quite the singular funneled authority that let a small number of Egyptian rulers marshal the labour to raise structures like the pyramids at Giza. Or perhaps not. Perhaps something like centralised kingship would have emerged along the Nile anyway, driven by factors that had nothing to do with desert scarcity, and the wider Green Sahara would simply have existed alongside it as a rich, populous neighbouring region, rather than as its replacement. We genuinely cannot know. What we can say with more confidence is what almost certainly wouldn't have happened. The specific, desperate concentration of an entire region's population onto one river, driven by the fact that everywhere else had become uninhabitable. That particular pressure, the pressure that in our history built one of the ancient world's most singular civilizations, simply never gets applied. Whatever emerges instead, along the Nile and across the wider Green Sahara around it, grows up under a fundamentally gentler set of constraints than the ones that shaped the world we actually inherited. And it is worth remembering that gentler constraints don't necessarily mean less ambitious outcomes, only differently motivated ones. Chapter 8. The Trade That Never Needed a Camel. If the last chapter left us in genuinely speculative territory, this one gives us something a little more solid to stand on, because it concerns not the deep origins of Nile civilization, but a much later, much better documented chapter of African history, the rise of the great trans-Saharan trading empires. In our timeline, the desert that had swallowed the Green Sahara eventually became, paradoxically, an economic opportunity rather than a mere obstacle, precisely because crossing it was so difficult, so dangerous, and so dependent on specialised knowledge and equipment. The handful of traders who could manage it profitably controlled access to goods that couldn't easily reach the Mediterranean world any other way. Gold from the forests and savannas of West Africa, salt from deposits deep in the desert's interior, valuable enough in a hot climate to be traded quite literally at close to its weight in gold. This trade, running along a small number of viable desert routes, and dependent almost entirely on the camel, which wasn't introduced to North Africa in significant numbers until roughly the 3rd century of the Common Era, became the economic foundation for a succession of extraordinarily wealthy West African empires, Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai, each controlling and taxing the flow of gold and salt across the desert, each producing cities, scholarship, and monumental architecture funded substantially by the profits of that difficult, dangerous crossing. The Emperor Mansa Musa of Mali, whose 14th century pilgrimage to Mecca famously involved so much gold that his spending is said to have depressed the metal's value across the regions he passed through for years afterward, is perhaps the single most vivid illustration of just how much wealth this trans-Saharan trade could generate, built almost entirely on the economics of scarcity. Goods that were common on one side of the desert and desperately wanted on the other, separated by a barrier difficult enough to cross that only a relatively small number of specialised traders ever managed it. In our alternate timeline, that barrier simply isn't there in anything like the same form. A Sahara threaded with rivers and dotted with lakes, its interior grasslands still supporting settled populations rather than empty of everything but sand and the rare oasis, would never have functioned as the kind of forbidding camel-dependent frontier that made trans-Saharan trade so lucrative and so tightly controlled in our history. If gold and salt and other goods could move between West Africa and the Mediterranean coast, along a continuous chain of rivers and settle regions rather than across a single dangerous crossing, the economics change completely. Trade becomes easier, which generally means it becomes more distributed, more competitive, and less capable of generating the kind of concentrated empire-building profit margins that a genuine bottleneck creates. Where our history produced a small number of fabulously wealthy trading empires controlling access to a scarce, difficult route, this timeline more plausibly produces a wider, messier network of exchange, with wealth and goods flowing along many parallel paths rather than being funneled through a small number of desert crossing specialists. This does not mean West Africa would have been poorer in this alternate history. If anything, easier connectivity between the region's gold and agricultural wealth and the wider Mediterranean and Middle Eastern trading world could plausibly have meant more total wealth changing hands, more frequent contact, faster movement of technology and ideas in both directions. What it does mean is that the specific form that wealth and power took in our history, the specific rise of empires whose strength was built on controlling a scarce and dangerous route, likely never happens in quite the same way. Mansa Musa's gold-laden pilgrimage, as spectacular a historical episode as it is, exists in our history precisely because the desert made that gold rare enough on the far side of the crossing to be spectacular. Take away the desert's bottleneck, and you very plausibly take away the specific economic conditions that made an empire like Mali possible in that particular form. The corridor that never closed, the one we set down a few chapters ago, ripples all the way forward into questions of empire, wealth and power, a full 10,000 years after the divergence point that opened it. Chapter 9. Dust, Wind, and a Different Amazon. Here's something that surprises most people the first time they hear it, and it's entirely real in our own timeline. The Sahara doesn't just sit there being a desert in isolation. It actively fertilizes a rainforest on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles away. The Bodele Depression, a dry lake bed in northern Chad that once formed part of the floor of Paleolake Mega-Chad, is today one of the single largest sources of atmospheric dust on the entire planet. Strong winds funneling through a gap between two mountain ranges scour fine, mineral-rich sediment off the ancient lake bed and loft it high into the atmosphere, where it gets carried west across the Atlantic on the trade winds, drifting for days before settling in significant quantities onto the Amazon rainforest. That dust is rich in phosphorus, a nutrient the Amazon's ancient heavily leached soils are chronically short of, and research tracking the dust's journey has found that this transatlantic delivery genuinely matters to the health of the forest it lands on, replenishing nutrients that would otherwise simply wash away in the rain and never return. It is a strange and rather beautiful fact about our actual world. A rainforest on one side of an ocean is partly sustained by a desert on the other, and it exists only because Paleolake Mega-Chad dried up and left behind exactly the kind of fine, easily wind-eroded sediment that makes the Bodele Depression such an effective dust source in the first place. In our alternate timeline, this relationship simply doesn't exist, or at least not in anything like the same form. If Mega-Chad never dried into the Bodele Depression, if it remained instead a vast, stable lake ringed by vegetation, there would be no exposed, unconsolidated lake bed for the wind to scour, and dramatically less dust, making that long transatlantic journey. This is speculation about a genuinely complex, tightly linked global system, and it's worth being honest that we don't know exactly how much less dust would cross the Atlantic, or exactly how the Amazon would respond to a phosphorus supply reduced from what it actually receives in our world. But the mechanism is well enough understood that the general direction of the effect seems reasonably solid. A green, wet Sahara means less dust, and less dust reaching the Amazon means a rainforest working with a smaller nutrient subsidy than the one it actually gets in our history. Whether that would have meant a smaller, less productive Amazon, or simply a forest that developed different nutrient cycling strategies to compensate over thousands of years, the way ecosystems generally do adapt to the resources actually available to them, is genuinely beyond what we can confidently say. What we can say is that the Sahara's dryness in our own timeline isn't just a regional story about North Africa, it's stitched into the functioning of an entire rainforest on another continent, which means a Sahara that stayed green wouldn't just have changed North Africa. It would have sent ripples across an ocean into an ecosystem most people would never think to connect to a desert 7,000 miles away. There's a broader lesson tucked into this dust, and it's one worth carrying into everything that follows. Nothing on this planet changes in isolation. A shift in one region's rainfall, seemingly local, seemingly contained, turns out to be wired into the health of a rainforest on the far side of an ocean. Our alternate Sahara doesn't just rewrite North Africa, it reaches out in small and large ways into systems we haven't even discussed yet. Chapter 10. The Green Heart's Megafauna. Let's turn now to the animals, because in our actual history, the end of the African humid period wasn't just a human story. It was, for a huge range of species, a story of retreat, contraction, and in some cases disappearance from the Sahara altogether. Elephants once ranged across the entire Green Sahara, their presence documented in rock art from Mauritania in the west to the Nile in the east. As the desert closed in, their populations retreated southward with the shrinking grasslands, and today the elephants that survive in the wider region are found only well to the south, in the Sahel and beyond. A shadow of a range that once spanned an entire subcontinent. Giraffes tell a similar story. Rock art shows them across the Sahara's full breadth, but their modern range has contracted to isolated pockets far south of where their ancestors once browsed. Crocodiles, remarkably, held on the longest and in the strangest way, with small relict populations of the West African crocodile surviving in isolated desert pools and oases well into the modern era. Animals that geneticists have shown are the direct descendants of the crocodiles that once filled the great Saharan lakes, stranded for thousands of years in shrinking puddles as the world around them dried. Some of these populations only being formally studied and confirmed in the past few decades. In our alternate timeline, none of that contraction happens, or at least not in the same drastic form. Elephants, giraffes, buffalo, antelope of every description, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, all of them would simply have continued occupying the range they'd held for thousands of years during the humid period's peak, because the habitat that supported them never disappeared out from under them. Picture, 10,000 years after the divergence, an elephant population ranging across the entire Green Sahara in something like the numbers and distribution that once made this region one of the richest wildlife landscapes on the continent. Herds moving between the shores of Mega Chad and the river valleys of the Tamanrasat and the grasslands stretching toward the Atlantic coast, entirely unremarkable, simply part of the ordinary furniture of this world, the way wildebeest herds are part of the ordinary furniture of the Serengeti in ours. Even the smaller, less charismatic grazers would have held their ground rather than retreating. The Dorcas, gazelle, and the addax, animals that in our actual history had to evolve extraordinary tolerance for heat and water scarcity simply to survive in the shrinking margins the desert left them, might instead have remained ordinary, unremarkable grassland grazers, never needing to develop the specialized physiology that today lets a handful of desert antelope species survive in some of the harshest terrain on the planet, because that terrain would never have existed for them to need to survive it. The predator populations that depend on this kind of abundant prey base would have thrived right alongside it. Lions, which in our history still range across parts of West and Central Africa but have vanished entirely from the actual Sahara, would plausibly have remained a fixture of Saharan grasslands throughout, hunting the same buffalo and antelope herds their ancestors hunted 8,000 years ago. Wild dogs, hyenas, leopards, all species whose modern African ranges represent contracted, fragmented remnants of what were once far more continuous distributions, would likely have kept significantly more of that historical range intact here, never having been squeezed by the same desertification that pushed so many species into the isolated pockets where conservationists work so hard to protect them today. And it isn't only the megafauna. A Green Sahara means an intact web of smaller species too. Birds using the region as a stopover or permanent habitat, rather than a forbidding barrier to cross on migration. Fish populations in the lake systems large and stable enough to support entire human fishing economies the way they clearly did during the humid period's actual peak. Insects and amphibians and all the smaller, less charismatic life that a functioning grassland and wetland ecosystem depends on and sustains. None of this is wild speculation. It's simply what already existed here for thousands of years before the drying began, extended forward across the additional millennia in which, in this timeline, the drying never came. There is something worth sitting with in this picture. Not a single species we've discussed tonight had to evolve anything new to persist in this alternate Sahara. They didn't need to become hardier, or more adapted to scarcity, or in any way different from what they already were at the humid period's height. They simply needed the world around them to keep offering what it had always offered. Extinction, in this telling, isn't really a story about failure on the animal's part. It's a story about a door closing on a world that had been working perfectly well until the door closed. Tonight, we're imagining the door staying open. Chapter 11. The Corridor Kept Open. We set something down a few chapters back and promised to return to it, so let's return to it now, because it may be the single largest consequence of everything we've imagined tonight. A Sahara that never became a barrier is a Sahara that never stopped being a bridge. In our actual deep history, long before the African humid period we've spent most of tonight discussing, the Sahara flickered between green and arid states many times, tracking that same 21,000-year orbital wobble, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. During its green phases, it functioned as a corridor connecting sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, and from there to the wider world beyond the continent. Researchers studying the timing of early human dispersals out of Africa have found that several of the major waves of movement line up suspiciously well with these Green Sahara windows, as though the door to the rest of the world only really opened when the desert temporarily stopped being a desert. When the rains failed and the Sahara closed back up, the door closed with it, and populations on either side were left more isolated from each other until the next green window opened tens of thousands of years later. The African humid period we've been imagining differently tonight was, in this sense, simply the most recent of these windows, and in our actual history it closed for what appears to be the final time around 6,000 years ago, sealing sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world behind a barrier that has remained largely intact ever since, punctuated only by the narrow, difficult routes that later trans-Saharan traders learned to navigate with enormous effort and specialized knowledge. In our alternate timeline, that window never closes, and a corridor that stays open doesn't just allow the occasional dramatic migration. It allows something far more continuous and, in the long run, probably far more significant: ongoing generation by generation contact between populations that, in our history, drifted apart both genetically and culturally once the desert cut them off from each other. Trade of ideas as well as goods, intermarriage and gene flow continuing steadily, rather than being reduced to the trickle that survived through the difficult desert routes of history's actual trans-Saharan trade. Languages and technologies and agricultural techniques moving back and forth across the Sahara, rather than developing largely in isolation on either side of it for thousands of years. This is, again, speculative territory, and it would be dishonest to pretend we can trace out with any precision exactly which languages would exist in this timeline, or exactly how genetically distinct or blended the populations north and south of the Sahara would have become by now. What we can say with more confidence is the general shape of the difference. Our actual history features two large African population groups, north and south of the Sahara, that spent the last 6,000 years developing along substantially separate tracks connected only by thin, difficult threads of contact. This alternate history features something more like a single, vast, continuously connected zone of human settlement, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the tropical forests of Central Africa, with all the blending and exchange that this kind of sustained contact tends to produce over deep time. It's worth noting, too, that this continuous corridor would have run in the other direction as well, connecting North Africa more fluidly to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, and by extension connecting sub-Saharan Africa to that same wider world more directly than it ever managed to in our actual history. Technologies, crops, domesticated animals, religious and philosophical ideas that in our timeline took circuitous, centuries-long routes to reach different parts of the continent might have moved with something closer to the speed and continuity we associate with connected rather than isolated regions. Again, we cannot say precisely what this would have produced, but the general principle that sustained connectivity tends to accelerate the exchange of ideas and technologies relative to isolation is about as well established as anything in the study of human history, and there is no reason to think it would have applied any less here than it has applied everywhere else we can actually observe it. The desert that, in our history, spent 6,000 years functioning as one of the most effective barriers to human movement on the planet, comparable in its isolating effect to an ocean, simply never finishes closing in this other timeline. And a continent that never had that particular wall built through its middle is very plausibly a continent whose entire human history, north and south, unfolds along genuinely different lines from the ones we actually inherited. Chapter 12. The Animal That Never Needed to Come. Before we tour the alternate present in full, there's one animal worth pausing on, because it might be the single most recognizable symbol of the Sahara in the popular imagination, And in this alternate timeline, it very plausibly never arrives at all. Camels are not, and never were, native to North Africa. The dromedary, the single-humped camel that has become almost synonymous with desert life in the popular imagination, originated on the Arabian Peninsula, and it wasn't introduced into the Sahara in significant numbers until surprisingly late, generally dated to sometime around the 3rd century of the Common Era, roughly 3,500 years after the actual African humid period had already ended and the desert had already fully formed. Before that introduction, crossing the Sahara relied on cattle, donkeys, and human portage, all of them poorly suited to genuinely long desert crossings, all of them requiring water and forage at intervals the true desert simply couldn't reliably provide across its most forbidding stretches. The camel changed that completely. Its physiology, capable of tolerating water loss and temperature swings that would kill most other large mammals, capable of going many days between drinking, capable of carrying substantial loads across terrain with essentially no reliable food or water along the way, is precisely what made the later trans-Saharan gold and salt trade we discussed a few chapters ago actually feasible at meaningful scale. Without the camel, the desert crossing that built the wealth of Ghana, Mali and Songhai would have remained far more limited, far more dangerous, far less economically viable. In a very real sense, the camel is not simply a desert animal. It is one of the key pieces of technology, biological rather than mechanical, that let humans exploit an already formed Sahara at all. In our alternate timeline, none of this ever happens, for the simplest possible reason. There's no desert crossing that requires it. A landscape of rivers, lakes, and grassland can be traversed the way any well-watered landscape is traversed, on foot, by boat, with cattle and donkeys perfectly adequate to the task, the way people and goods moved across well-watered sub-Saharan Africa for thousands of years without ever needing an animal specialized for extreme aridity. There would simply be no ecological or economic niche calling the camel north from Arabia in the first place. No desperate crossing desperate enough to justify importing and domesticating an animal from another continent entirely. The dromedary might well have remained exactly what it was before our actual history's 3rd century, an animal of the Arabian Peninsula and parts of the Middle East, its range never extending across a Sahara that had no need of what it offered. It's a small thing, in some ways, one missing animal in a documentary that has already reimagined an entire continent's worth of rivers and cities and civilizations. But it's worth sitting with, because it says something about how thoroughly this alternate world would diverge from the images most of us carry around in our heads. Ask almost anyone to picture the Sahara, and somewhere in that picture, very likely, is a line of camels silhouetted against a dune at sunset, a caravan crossing an endless sea of sand. That image, iconic as it is actually a remarkably recent one in the full sweep of Saharan history, no older than about 1800 years, a technological adaptation to a desert that itself had only existed for a few thousand years before the camel arrived to help humans cross it. In our alternate timeline, that entire picture, animal and desert both, simply never comes into being. Ask someone in that other world to picture their landscape, and you'd get elephants moving through grass, boats crossing open water, herds of cattle grazing beside a river, an image with no camels in it at all, because there was never a desert forbidding enough to call one across an ocean to help. Chapter 13. The Green Sahara in 2026. Let's bring the timeline all the way forward now to tonight, to this exact moment, and take a tour of what this alternate North Africa would actually look like. region by region, the way we might if we were standing somewhere high enough to see it all at once. Start in the west, along what is in our world the Atlantic coast of Mauritania and Western Sahara, one of the most starkly, beautifully empty coastal deserts on the planet in our actual history. Dunes rolling directly into the ocean, with barely a scrap of vegetation between them. In this alternate world, that coastline would instead be a fertile, populated frontier. Grasslands and river deltas meeting the Atlantic the way the mouth of a well-watered river meets an ocean anywhere else in the world. Fishing communities working both the ocean and the freshwater systems just inland. A coast that looks far more like the productive, populated stretches of West Africa's actual Atlantic coastline today than like the desert coast that actually exists a few hundred miles further north. Cross the border into what is today Morocco and Algeria's Atlas foothills and the plains beyond them, and in our actual world you'd find a fairly sharp line where Mediterranean agriculture gives way to true desert within a surprisingly short distance. In this alternate world, that line simply wouldn't exist in the same abrupt form. Instead, the transition from Mediterranean climate to the interior grasslands would likely unfold gradually across a much broader zone. Olive and grain country blending slowly into savanna rather than crashing straight into dune sea, the way ecological transitions usually happen, when nothing catastrophic has forced a sharp boundary between two very different systems. Move inland and eastward, toward the region that in our world is the empty, mountainous heart of the Sahara, the Hogar and Tassili massifs of southern Algeria. In our history, these are dramatic, otherworldly landscapes of bare volcanic rock and wind-carved stone, home to the rock art we discussed earlier, and almost nothing else, some of the most sparsely populated terrain on the planet. In this alternate present, the same mountains would rise out of grassland and forest rather than out of sand, their slopes probably wetter and more vegetated than the surrounding lowlands the way mountain ranges usually are, functioning as a kind of highland refuge and water source, feeding the rivers running down into the plains below, likely home to denser human settlement than the surrounding lowlands precisely because of that reliable water, rather than being, as they are in our history, one of the most forbidding and remote regions on the continent. Further south and east, the basin that in our world holds the shrunken remnant of Lake Chad, itself already a fraction of its size just a century ago and still shrinking, would instead hold something far closer to the ancient Mega Chad, at something approaching its historical peak, an inland sea by any reasonable definition, its shores supporting agriculture, fishing economies, and almost certainly substantial cities, functioning as a kind of freshwater anchor for the entire Central Sahara, the way the Caspian anchors the region around it in our actual world. The contrast here is about as stark as anywhere on this tour. A body of water whose modern shrinkage is, in our timeline, treated as a genuine environmental emergency for the millions of people who depend on what's left of it, restored in this alternate history to something like the scale it held 10,000 years ago. Continue east toward the Nile, and you'd find, as we discussed a few chapters back, a valley that's certainly still settled and still fertile, but that no longer stands as the singular, desperate exception in an otherwise lifeless landscape. Instead, it would be one prosperous, well-watered region, flowing naturally into a much wider zone of similarly prosperous, well-watered land extending west across the entire breadth of what is, in our world, the Sahara. Whatever cities and states exist along the Nile in this timeline would have neighbours, real neighbours, all along their western frontier, rather than facing hundreds of miles of empty desert in every direction except north and south. And running through the middle of the entire picture, the great herds we spent a full chapter imagining, elephants, giraffes, buffalo and antelope in numbers that would put the actual real-world Serengeti to shame simply by virtue of covering a far larger area, predators following them, birds filling the skies above lakes and rivers, rather than crossing hundreds of miles of lethal waterless desert on their seasonal migrations. The way so many bird species are forced to cross the actual Sahara today, a crossing that kills a substantial fraction of the individuals who attempt it every single year. What you would not see standing on this alternate landscape in 2026 is the Sahara as most of us have always pictured it, the endless dune seas of the empty quarter or the Grand Erg, the caravan routes, the isolated oasis towns clinging to survival at the edges of an ocean of sand. That version of North Africa, so deeply embedded in how we picture this part of the world, would simply never have come into being. In its place, a green, watered, populous heart of the continent, connecting rather than dividing everything around it, exactly the kind of landscape that existed here for thousands of years before a wobble in the planet's axis, tuned only slightly differently than it actually was, let it all slip away. Chapter 14, Where the Desert People Went. We've spent this entire documentary imagining a Sahara that stayed green, all the plants and animals and rivers and civilizations that would have flourished as a result. But there's a question we haven't addressed directly, one that might have been sitting quietly in the back of your mind since early on. What happens in this timeline to everything that in our actual history was built specifically to survive the desert? Because the real Sahara, arid and forbidding as it is, did not remain empty of human life after the rains failed. It became home to some of the most remarkable adaptations to extreme scarcity found anywhere on the planet. Nomadic pastoral cultures like the Tuareg developed deep, sophisticated knowledge of where water could reliably be found across seemingly featureless terrain, of how to navigate by stars and dunes across distances that would be lethal to anyone without that knowledge, of camel husbandry so refined that it turned one of the most difficult environments on Earth into something that could, with enough skill, be crossed and even lived in. Oasis agriculture developed intricate irrigation systems capable of coaxing dates, grains and vegetables out of a handful of naturally watered pockets scattered across an otherwise lifeless landscape. Entire architectural traditions evolved around managing extreme heat with nothing but thick mud brick walls, small windows, and clever orientation toward the prevailing wind. None of this would exist in anything like the same form in our alternate timeline, because the pressure that produced it, the raw, unforgiving scarcity of the actual desert, simply never arrives. The specific genius of Tuareg desert navigation, developed over centuries of genuine necessity, wouldn't be needed in a landscape where water is reliably available across most of the region rather than concentrated in a handful of widely scattered points. The specific architectural and agricultural adaptations that let human communities flourish in some of the hottest, driest inhabited places on the planet simply wouldn't have had the environmental pressure that called them into being in the first place. This isn't a story about failure, though, any more than the mammal's long confinement to the shadows in an earlier documentary about dinosaurs was a story about failure. The peoples who built lives in and around the actual Sahara did something remarkable. They took one of the most hostile environments on the planet and made it not just survivable, but in places genuinely rich in its own right, culturally and economically. Losing that particular set of adaptations in our alternate timeline isn't a tragedy playing out somewhere in this other world. It's simply the absence of a challenge that never had to be met, because the conditions that demanded it never arose. The skill, the ingenuity, the cultural depth that desert life required in our history would presumably have gone somewhere else instead, applied to whatever challenges this wetter, more forgiving landscape did present. Managing seasonal floods, perhaps, or navigating dense wetlands, or organising large-scale fishing economies across enormous lake systems, all real challenges with their own real complexity, just different ones. There's also a quieter loss worth naming, honestly. The extraordinary rock art itself, the paintings at Tassili Nadja and Gilf Kabir that survive today precisely because the desert that swallowed the world they depicted also, almost accidentally, preserved the art describing it, protected for thousands of years by exactly the aridity that ended the way of life the paintings recorded. In a world where the Sahara never dried, that specific poignant archive, a civilization's memory of its own vanished green world, painted onto stone by people who could see the desert closing in around them, would never have needed to exist, because there would have been no vanished world to mourn and no closing desert to race against. Whatever this alternate world's people did paint, wherever they did paint it, would have been telling a different story entirely. Not elegy, but simply life. Ongoing and unremarkable, the way most of history usually is when nothing forces it to become a warning. Chapter 15. The Storms That Never Formed. Here's a piece of real-world meteorology that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, and it gives our alternate Sahara one more far-reaching consequence, this time reaching not into a rainforest but into the heart of hurricane season. Every summer, as Atlantic hurricanes form and strengthen off the West African coast, they're doing so in the presence of something called the Saharan air layer, a mass of hot, extremely dry, dust-laden air that lifts off the actual Sahara Desert and pushes out over the tropical Atlantic at altitudes of a few thousand meters. This layer is, in a very real sense, hostile to hurricane formation. Its dryness can choke off the moisture that developing storms need to organize and intensify. Its heat creates a temperature inversion that suppresses the vertical convection storms depend on, and the strong winds embedded within it can shear apart a storm structure before it ever has the chance to consolidate into something dangerous. Meteorologists tracking the Saharan air layer's seasonal strength have found a real, measurable relationship. Years when it's unusually strong and dusty tend to correlate with quieter hurricane seasons, and years when it's weak tend to see more storms forming and intensifying. All of that dust, all of that heat, all of that dryness traces back to the same source we've spent tonight discussing. A large, arid, exposed Sahara, its surface baking under direct sun with nothing green to hold moisture or temper the heat, its loose sediment constantly available for the wind to lift skyward. Take that away, replace it with the green, watered, vegetated Sahara we've been imagining, and the Saharan air layer as we currently know it likely wouldn't exist in anything like its current form. Less exposed sediment means less dust lofted into the atmosphere. A cooler, wetter land surface means less of the extreme heating that drives the layer's temperature inversion in the first place. the whole mechanism that currently helps keep a portion of Atlantic hurricane activity in check would be, at minimum, substantially weakened. This is speculative territory in its specifics, because hurricane formation depends on dozens of interacting factors beyond the Saharan air layer alone, ocean temperature above all. But the general direction of the effect is grounded in genuine, well-studied atmospheric science, and it points towards something almost unsettling to sit with: a greener, more hospitable Sahara, better for the people and animals living directly on it, might have meant a rougher ride for the coastlines of the Caribbean and the southeastern United States, with fewer of their storms getting quietly suppressed before they ever had the chance to become dangerous. The Atlantic hurricanes that did form in this timeline might, on average, have found conditions somewhat more favourable to intensify, unchecked by a dry, dusty shield that, in our actual history, doesn't exist for the benefit of anyone. It's simply a side effect of a desert that happens to sit where it sits. It's a strange kind of symmetry to end this thought on. The same abrupt drying that displaced elephants and giraffes and emptied out an entire green interior of the continent may also, almost as an afterthought, be quietly protecting coastlines thousands of miles away, every single hurricane season, in a mechanism most people who live along those coastlines have never even heard of. Nothing about this planet's system stays neatly inside the borders we draw on our maps. A wobble in Earth's axis 40 centuries ago may be reaching all the way into next week's weather forecast on the other side of an ocean, and it would have been reaching into a very different forecast indeed in the world we're imagining tonight. Chapter 16. Gods of Aweta. World. Every civilization we know of built stories and beliefs around the resources it feared losing most, and in our actual history, across the arid and semi-arid stretches of North Africa and the Near East, an enormous amount of religious and mythological imagination organized itself around water, its scarcity, its preciousness, its arrival as blessing and its absence as punishment. Rain became something closely bound up with divine favour. Drought became something closely bound up with divine anger or absence, or a test of faith. Springs and wells and rivers became sacred sites, not incidentally, but because the actual physical stakes of finding or losing water were high enough to make that sanctity feel entirely earned. The Nile itself was worshipped quite literally as a god in ancient Egypt, its annual flood treated as a sacred and essential mercy rather than a mundane hydrological event, precisely because a poor flood year could mean genuine famine for an entire civilization concentrated onto its banks. In a Green Sahara, where water is abundant rather than desperately scarce across most of the region, it's worth wondering, carefully and speculatively, whether that particular thread of religious imagination would have developed with anything like the same intensity. This is genuinely soft territory, more a thought experiment than a claim, but it rests on a reasonably solid general principle from the study of religion and culture, that spiritual traditions tend to organize themselves, at least in part, around whatever in the surrounding environment poses the greatest uncertainty or the greatest stakes for survival. Societies built around abundant, reliable water might instead have organized more of their spiritual imagination around other uncertainties. The unpredictability of seasonal floods on the many rivers threading the region, perhaps, or the health of the great herds, the way pastoral societies elsewhere have often centred their spiritual lives on cattle and their well-being, or simply different anxieties entirely. ones that don't map neatly onto anything in our actual religious history because they'd be responding to an entirely different set of everyday pressures. We can say a little more confidently that the physical monuments and sacred sites of this alternate world would likely look different too. Much of what survives from actual ancient North African and Near Eastern religious architecture, particularly around oases and river valleys, was built with such permanence and investment specifically because water in these locations was rare enough to be worth monumentalizing, worth building something that would outlast the builder's ingratitude or supplication. A landscape where good water is common rather than rare might have produced less of that particular kind of monumental water shrine, simply because the specific acute preciousness that motivated so much of that building never applied in the same way. None of this is to say a Green Sahara's people would have had a thinner spiritual life, only a different one, organised around different scarcity and different abundances, the way every human culture's beliefs eventually organise themselves around whatever the actual world hands them to work with. We are, all of us, in every timeline, telling stories about the things we're most afraid of losing. Chapter 17. A warmer planet meets a green Sahara. One more layer is worth adding before we close, because it brings this whole thought experiment into direct contact with something very much alive in our own actual present. The question of what a warming planet does to a landscape like this one. In our real timeline, climate scientists have spent years debating exactly this question in reverse, wondering whether continued global warming might eventually push the monsoon back north again, regreening portions of the actual current Sahara, the way it greened naturally during the orbital cycles of the deep past. Some climate models do suggest exactly that. A strengthening West African monsoon under warming conditions, expanding vegetation into the Sahara's southern fringe over the coming decades and centuries. It's a strange, almost hopeful thread buried inside an otherwise alarming body of research. The idea that the same warming reshaping so much of the planet in difficult ways might, in this one particular place, push things back towards something closer to the green world this documentary has spent its runtime imagining. In our alternate timeline, that same modern warming would be arriving at a landscape that never dried out in the first place, and the question becomes not whether the desert might green, but what happens to an already green, already settled, already populous Sahara as global temperatures climb. A stronger monsoon layered onto an already wet region could plausibly mean more rainfall still, expanded lakes, wetter grasslands pushing even further north than their historical maximum. Or it could mean something more disruptive, shifts in the timing and reliability of rains that a system finely balanced around thousands of years of consistent seasonal patterns might struggle to absorb smoothly, flooding, replacing the gentle, predictable pulse of wet and dry seasons that had defined this landscape for 10,000 years. Real river systems and lake ecosystems everywhere in our actual world are discovering right now that gradual, reliable climate change is often far easier to adapt to than the more erratic, less predictable extremes that a warming atmosphere tends to bring with it. And there's no obvious reason our imagined Sahara would be immune to that same difficulty. There's something worth noticing in this too. In this alternate world, an enormous population spread across rivers and lakes and grasslands rather than concentrated onto one narrow, easily monitored valley would be facing modern climate change from a very different starting position than the one humanity actually occupies. More distributed populations can mean more resilience, more room to shift and adapt as conditions change locally. It can also mean more places at risk simultaneously, more coastline and floodplain and lakeshore exposed to a changing climate rather than the comparatively concentrated exposure of, say, a single river valley. We genuinely cannot know which of these effects would have dominated. What we can say is that this alternate Sahara wouldn't have been a static, finished picture, immune to the same forces reshaping our actual present. It would have kept changing, the way every real landscape keeps changing, carried forward by the same restless planet that built it in the first place, and that is, in our own timeline right now, quietly renegotiating the terms of the actual desert's future too. Chapter 18. The Pyramids That Might Not Be. Let's end our tour of the alternate present with one very specific, very concrete question, because it's the kind of question that tends to stick with people long after a documentary like this one ends. Would the pyramids still exist? It's worth being precise about why the actual pyramids were built, where and how they were. Old Kingdom Egypt, around 4,500 years ago, commanded a level of centralized authority over labor and resources that allowed its rulers to organize tens of thousands of workers over decades to move and place millions of limestone blocks with a precision that still impresses engineers today. That kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. It requires a state capable of feeding, housing, and directing an enormous workforce for extended periods, which requires reliable agricultural surplus, which in Old Kingdom Egypt meant reliable control over the Nile's flood cycle across the entire valley, harvest after harvest, decade after decade. The pyramids, in other words, are not simply monuments to religious belief or royal ego, impressive as both of those motivations clearly were. They are monuments to a very particular, very concentrated form of political and agricultural control, the kind that a population squeezed onto one narrow, irreplaceable river valley was uniquely positioned to develop. We spent an earlier chapter arguing that this specific squeeze, the funneling of an entire region's population onto the Nile because everywhere else had turned to desert, might never have happened in our alternate timeline. If that's right, then the particular flavour of hyper-centralised authority that built the pyramids may never have developed in quite the same form either. A Nile valley that was one prosperous region among several, rather than the last refuge for an entire subcontinent's population, might never have needed or been able to concentrate labour and resources on the scale required to raise structures like the Great Pyramid of Giza. But it would be too simple to conclude that monumental architecture itself never would have emerged here. Human societies build monuments for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with desert-driven desperation, and plenty of genuinely impressive ancient architecture arose in far less centralized, far less water-stressed societies than Old Kingdom Egypt. It's entirely plausible that this alternate world's river and lake-based city-states, wealthier in some ways than our actual Egypt, for never having had to spend so much of their surplus simply managing flood risk and maintaining irrigation infrastructure across a fragile narrow valley, might have built their own monuments, temple complexes ringing the shores of Mega Chad perhaps, or stone architecture marking the confluence points where the Tamanrasat and its tributaries met, built by societies organised around trade and abundance rather than around the tight top-down control that a scarcity-driven river valley seems to reward. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that these monuments, whatever form they took, would not look like the pyramids, because the pyramids are not simply a stone shape that any sufficiently ambitious ancient society eventually arrives at. They are the specific architectural signature of a specific kind of political and geographic pressure, the pressure of an entire civilization balanced on the maintenance of one irreplaceable river, and that particular pressure, in the world we're imagining tonight, quite plausibly never applies at all. Somewhere on the shores of an alternate Mega-Chad, or along a still flowing Tamanrasart, this world's version of monumental ambition might be standing right now in a shape none of us have ever seen, honouring gods and rulers we've never heard of, built by a civilization whose Great Pyramid equivalent has nothing at all to do with sand. Chapter 19. The Eye That Would Still Be Watching. There's one more landmark worth visiting before we close, because it offers something none of the rest of tonight's tour can, a feature that would have looked almost the same in both timelines, a fixed point of comparison between the world we have and the one we're imagining. In the heart of Mauritania sits the reshaped structure, sometimes called the Eye of the Sahara, a set of concentric rock rings roughly 50 kilometres across, so vast and so geometrically precise that it was first noticed not by geologists on the ground but by astronauts, who used it for decades as a landmark to orient themselves during early space missions, its bullseye shape unmistakable from orbit against the pale, featureless sand surrounding it. It's not an impact crater, despite how it looks. It's the eroded remnant of a dome of rock that was pushed upward by geological forces deep underground tens of millions of years ago, then slowly, patiently carved into its current ring shape by many millions of years of weathering and erosion, exposing progressively older and harder layers of rock as the softer material around them wore away. That deep geological history is completely indifferent to the presence or absence of the African humid period. The dome that formed the reshaped structure was already tens of millions of years old by the time humans existed at all, let alone by the time the Sahara's monsoon began its most recent 14,000-year flicker between green and arid. In our alternate timeline, the Eye of the Sahara would still be there, in exactly the same place, with exactly the same concentric rings, because nothing about a stronger monsoon or a stayed vegetation feedback loop reaches back far enough or deep enough to have altered rock formed and shaped across tens of millions of years. What would be different is everything around it. In our actual world, the reshaped structure sits in one of the most starkly empty stretches of desert on the planet, its rings visible with such clarity partly because there is nothing else, no vegetation, no water, no competing texture to soften or obscure its outline against the surrounding sand. In this alternate world, the same rings would rise instead out of grassland, perhaps out of forest along their lower, wetter margins, perhaps with a lake or seasonal wetland pooling somewhere within the outer rings, the way water often collects in similar geological basins elsewhere in the world. It would still be recognizable as the same formation, the same rings, the same origin story written in the same rock. It just wouldn't look anything like the desert curiosity it appears as today. It would look like a strange ancient green amphitheatre, its concentric ridges wooded or grassed, its centre perhaps holding water, a landmark that early astronauts in this alternate history might have struggled to pick out from orbit at all, buried as it would be in the same green that covered everything around it. There's something almost comforting in fixing on this one point of continuity between the two timelines we've spent tonight exploring, because everything else we've imagined, the rivers, the lakes, the civilizations, the animals, the trade routes, the gods, has been built from reasoning about systems that could plausibly have gone differently, chains of cause and effect stretching out from one small change in a feedback loop 6,000 years ago. The Risha structure reminds us that not everything is up for negotiation, that some of what makes a place runs deeper than any single climate cycle, however dramatic. The Sahara you know and the Sahara we've imagined tonight would still, in this one specific spot, share the exact same bones. Only the skin draped over them, green in one telling, bare in the other, would have turned out any different at all. Chapter 20. The Question of Water. Here's a strange thought to end on. If you're hearing this, if these words are reaching you in whatever room you're falling asleep in tonight, then the Sahara dried. That's the quiet paradox sitting underneath this entire thought experiment. The version of human history capable of producing someone curious enough, comfortable enough, technologically equipped enough to lie in the dark and wonder about an alternate desert is a version of history that was shaped, in ways large and small, by the actual desert and everything its formation set in motion. The concentration of population onto the Nile, the particular pressures that helped produce the particular civilizations that eventually produced you. That doesn't mean an alternate history without that pressure would have produced nothing worth calling civilization or nothing worth calling remarkable. It almost certainly would have. Just built along different lines, out of different pressures, arriving at different destinations that we genuinely cannot predict from here. Human ingenuity, cooperation, curiosity and ambition don't require scarcity and desperation to express themselves. They simply express themselves differently depending on what the world actually offers, and a world offering rivers and lakes and grassland across an entire subcontinent, rather than forcing everyone onto one narrow life-or-death ribbon of water, would very plausibly have produced its own forms of greatness, its own cities, its own art and science and architecture, simply not the specific forms we happen to recognize as ancient Egypt, ancient Mali, or any of the other civilizations that our actual thirsty history produced. Consider, one last time, everything that stood or fell on that single threshold 6,000 years ago, where a struggling landscape either recovered or didn't, an elephant range spanning a continent, or elephants pushed into isolated southern refuges, a civilization built around desperate centralized control of one river, or a wide, loosely connected network of river and lake societies stretching from ocean to ocean. A camel imported across a sea to make a killing crossing survivable, or no crossing difficult enough to need one in the first place. A rock art tradition preserving the memory of a vanished world, or simply life, continuing, with nothing yet lost worth painting as elegy. All of it, every thread we've pulled tonight, traces back to soil holding or soil failing to hold, across what may have been no more than a handful of unusually dry decades. There's a temptation, when we imagine a world with less hardship, to assume it must also be a lesser world, a world with less to show for itself, because so much of what we celebrate about human history seems tangled up with struggle and scarcity and the ingenuity required to survive them. But struggle isn't what makes a civilization worth having existed. It's simply one of many possible pressures that shapes what a civilization looks like once it exists. A green Sahara stitched through with rivers and lakes and grassland stretching from the Atlantic to the Nile wouldn't have been an easier world in some diminished lesser sense. It would have been a different world, full of its own difficulties we haven't even imagined tonight, floods instead of drought, different diseases thriving in wetter climates, different conflicts over different resources, its own history of struggle and triumph running along entirely different lines from the ones we actually inherited. What it would not have needed, though, is us, exactly as we are, worrying about it from exactly where we're lying right now. And that's fine. That's more than fine. The actual world, dry Sahara and all, produced you. Produced this exact quiet moment. Produced whatever has brought you to listen to a story about a desert that never happened. That's not a small thing. That's the entire improbable chain of events that got you here. So as you drift off, picture it one more time. Not the desert you know, but the other one, the green one. Grass moving in wind under a sky full of birds that never had to risk a deadly crossing to get where they were going. Water sitting quietly in lakes that, in our actual history, finished drying up before anyone had learned to write. Somewhere in that other world, if it existed, night would be falling too. The same stars turning slowly overhead, indifferent to which version of the story played out beneath them. Two Saharas, two timelines, the same darkness settling gently over both. The rains stopped, in the world we actually have. And here you are, 6,000 years later, drifting towards sleep, listening to a story about the water that, in some other unrealized version of this planet, never stopped falling. Never once, across 10,000 quiet years that never needed to end.